This is the main goal of this company. Not only does fame produce heroes, it also devours them. Hulk Hogan, a living representation of strength, faith, and glory, came to represent American might in the 1980s. Millions were influenced by his remarks. His reputation became inviolable. The man behind the mask, Terry Bollea, was subtly cracking behind the hero's mask, while the rest of the world worshipped him. This isn't a wrestling story. It's a tale about deception, identity, and the price of becoming a legend. This explains how Hulk Hogan managed to live a double life and get away with it for so long. The creation of a legend. Terry Bollea was a lanky, awkward youngster growing up on the streets of Tampa, Florida. Long before his name became a battle cry, and before arenas were inundated with red and yellow. With an enormous frame and an even greater sense of ambition, he was a dreamer. Terry's childhood idols were superheroes from comic books, rock singers who seemed to be able to command entire crowds with a single gesture, bodybuilders on Muscle Beach, and larger-than-life personalities. Professional wrestling in the early 1970s was a bizarre underworld that combined elements of vaudeville and athletic competition. Smoky arenas and poorly lit armories, filled with grizzled veterans and local strong guys, were the venues for the matches. Even if the audience was aware that wrestling was an act, the finest wrestlers managed to temporarily ignore this fact. The careful balance between fiction and reality was the foundation of the business. And Terry, now known as the Hulk, entered this arena for the first time. He wasn't a polished icon when he arrived. The journey was relentless. The early bouts were hard, and the compensation was meager. However, Terry Bollea possessed something that the industry was unable to overlook: existence. He resembled the American dream sculpted from flesh, standing 6'6", with arms as massive as tree trunks, and a shock of blonde hair. More significant, though, was his extraordinary capacity for crowd reading. He learned the rhythms of expectation and release, memorized the cheers of others, and observed how others responded. A metamorphosis started as he refined his character. The mustache became more pronounced, and the colored hair lighter. He began yelling into the sky, showing off in the spotlight, and transforming his own body into a representation of power and victory. It wasn't just a ploy. By the time he took on the persona of Hulk Hogan, the mythos was alive and well. Pop culture in the United States changed in the 1980s. There was television everywhere. Action figures were everywhere on toy shop shelves, and Saturday morning cartoons were the norm. Hulk Hogan was well positioned for this new age of mass media and popular imagination when he burst onto the national stage. He instantly rose to fame, the man who seemed to combine integrity, hope, and invincibility into one package, able to unite both parents and children. Like wildfire, Hulkamania spread across the nation. Catchphrases reverberated throughout schoolyards. Children mimicked the wild-eyed hero they watched every weekend by tearing shirts down the middle and flexing in front of their bedroom mirrors. However, the room for Terry Bollea, the man behind the mask, seemed to get smaller as the applause increased. Each public appearance turned into a new chapter in a story that he was unable to change. The act included each handshake. There was no space for honesty or weariness in any interview. It was all an act. The wrestler and the person became less distinct until the character was all that was left. Terry Bollea's private life dwindled as Hulk Hogan gained popularity. Millions of people liked him, yet nearly no one understood him. He was both a hero and a prisoner. Now Hulk Hogan was too valuable to be uncharacteristic, too ingrained in American society to acknowledge weakness or fear. The guy beneath the myth learned how to disappear, and the world craved the myth. An expression of a generation. Hulk Hogan was well known outside of the wrestling arena by the late 1980s. His image appeared on everything from movie posters to cereal cartons. Kids awoke to animated adaptations of his exploits. Television executives viewed him as the perfect representative of family-friendly heroism, and parents purchased action figurines for their children's birthdays. In living rooms, parks, and gyms all throughout the nation, his personal motto, "Train hard, say your prayers, and consume your vitamins," became a generational code. Now, Hogan was the smiling titan who thrilled kids and calmed worried parents as the face of mainstream American ideals. However, the distance between his two personas, Terry Bollea and Hulk Hogan, became insurmountable behind the scenes. He was living an increasingly severe double life. The demands were unrelenting. The business needed a clean image. Regardless of the personal cost, the hero had to appear unrelenting, morally pure, and physically unbeatable. Perfection came at a tremendous cost to Terry. The trip itinerary led to exhausting weeks spent away from home, hotel room nights, and ongoing press and promoter scrutiny. He had no place to retreat to, no place where he could just be himself. His voice, which had been quiet and reflective, became louder and more theatrical as a result of the character he had created. The strain of his fame also affected his home life. Once based on affection and support for one another, his marriage to Linda faltered under the never-ending barrage of responsibilities. Every second ran the risk of turning into another scene, another chance to further solidify the hero's image. Instead of being a haven, the bully at home turned into a shadow of the stage. They took pictures and videos of birthday celebrations, holidays, and even casual dinners. Every gesture is closely observed to ensure authenticity. Linda noticed the change. Even their most intimate moments were shadowed by the myth, which persisted despite her love for the man. The Hulk Hogan brand seemed to have taken over Terry's personal life, leaving the real Terry with nowhere to turn. Terry Bollea sensed that he was becoming smaller in the spotlight. Despite his flawless portrayal of the hero, he became more and more detached from his core with each performance. Fans believed that he was unbeatable. He was disappearing in his own heart, the golden cage of fame. As it happened, success was a form of imprisonment in and of itself. The man and the myth were inextricably linked by the 1990s. Terry Bollea was besieged by admirers and harassed by curious people whenever she went into a store, restaurant, or even a petrol station. The walls were closing in on him. His voice, which was previously only used for commercials and interviews, became permanent. Once a humorous joke for the cameras, the oversized sour brother cadence began to intrude into everyday conversations. He was now able to communicate exclusively in the myth. Buying groceries or going to his kids' soccer matches turned into a show. Terry Bollea, a father and husband, was invisible to the world. They saw a superhero dressed in streetwear, Hulk Hogan. Once a getaway, professional wrestling has evolved into a way to preserve one's identity. The myth was bolstered by each match, promotional appearance, and endorsement. Promoters wanted him to always act heroic. Sponsors insisted that he embody the principles of their merchandise, as though their belief could keep him timeless and unbeatable. The supporters who had helped make him a star now demanded perfection. The shift was even more noticeable at home. Linda Bollea observed the seeming disappearance of her husband's true self. Their chats were less frequent and more focused on scheduling and appearances. Even her tender moments seemed staged, as though she were embracing a fictional character rather than her spouse. The kids grew up in the lengthy shadow of Hulkamania, occasionally not knowing the difference between the legend and their father. He wasn't living a lie, though. In a sense, it was self-preservation. Terry Bollea had realized what he had committed to when he entered the world of professional wrestling. Only the myth would be accepted by the world. Everything he had constructed would be at jeopardy if he asked questions, displayed weakness, or simply took his mask off for a moment. Even at the expense of his own identity as the ideal family on television, he became an adept at giving people what they wanted. With the debut of Hogan Knows Best in 2005, American television achieved a new level of intimacy and spectacle. For Hogan's idea was brilliant. Take viewers inside the house of the most famous professional wrestler, portray him as the perfect family man, and transform the everyday life of the Bollea family into an easily readable weekly story. Due to the novelty of watching Hulk Hogan transform into Terry Bollea, millions of people tuned in to witness his double life. They wanted to see him exchange championship belts for wise counsel and body slams for bedtime tales. Sunlit optimism, a dedicated husband, a disciplined father, a home of happy order, and healthy laughing were all included in the show's opening titles. However, the action on screen was as meticulously planned as any wrestling match that was broadcast on pay-per-view. Selective editing and scripting were carefully combined to create the episodes. Post-production faded out flaws, routines were refined, and arguments were softened. The outcome was convincing. The American family ideal was personified by Hogan, Linda, and their kids. An oasis of stability in a world that is spinning faster every year, resilient and loving. But something else was happening behind the scenes. An already unstable family dynamic was further strained by each day of filming. In addition to their parents' constant supervision, Brooke and Nick grew up under the constant careful eye of a television team. Every motion was recorded, every error was recorded forever, and every secret was in danger of being revealed. At first excited to help her husband's new business, Linda started to feel as though the walls of her house were closing in on her. The lines between her private and public lives melting under the pressure of stage lights and production schedules. Early on, the family accepted the arrangement, since they thought it was new. However, the distinction between performance and true attachment became increasingly hazy as ratings skyrocketed and expectations rose. America was excited to see his double life and cheered, believing it was seeing the true heart of a cultural star. The genius of the show was in its ability to sell the idea of a perfect home as something that could be achieved, even commonplace, and to package ambition as reality. However, the truth was much more brittle. The choreography was what the audience took for genuineness. Every scene was a different brushstroke in a harmonious portrait that was unfit for close examination. In the end, the unity, the teachings, and the laughter were all for show. Even the most devoted admirers must have sensed it somewhere deep down. The smoothness of the Hogan family had a strange quality, a sense that perfection was more of a role played than a condition of being. We had always suspected him of trying to live a double life as both man and myth, without harming himself or others around him, rather than of dishonesty or treachery. How heavy the cape was! Terry Bollea had been a legend for a long time before Hogan knew best rolled cameras in his living room. A superhuman persona stitched together from theatrics, unadulterated strength, and an unbreakable smile. The Hulkamania era was based on spectacle and perspiration. That weight was no longer symbolic by the middle of the 20th century. Each handshake, public appearance, and piece of advice offered to devoted admirers turned into an additional thread in a cape that was too heavy to take off. Once inspiring millions with his messages of hope and tenacity, the hero was now constrained by his own image. The distinction between Terry Bollea, the man, and Hulk Hogan, the persona, became progressively blurred even at home. The muscles ache. The continual pressure to be flawless caused tension in the marriage. And family, which had been a safe refuge, became another obstacle to overcome. The idea of invincibility was never real. Cracks grew behind the surface of hope and strength. Terry struggled with the realization that the myth he had created had evolved into an ecosystem. His capacity to keep the illusion going was the foundation of networks, sponsors, and livelihoods. Once an elixir, the applause became hollow and reverberated with reminders that nothing lasts forever. He pondered who he was, without the admiration of the throng during his rare moments of seclusion. If the mask ever came off, who would he be? However, he was unable to stop. In addition to leaving the ring, stopping meant destroying the faith that had so many people in him. Heroes were required in the world. Letting rid of the act would entail revealing not only the weariness and agony, but also the vulnerability that was hidden behind every fake cheer and grin. Terry Bollea continued to live up to a version of himself that the world would not let go of, not because he was dishonest, but rather because of a persistent drive to live, to give, to perform, to live up to. The mirror has cracks. For decades, even as the earth beneath it changed, the public perception persisted. The world of wrestling underwent a transformation. There were new faces. The focus shifted to new stories. The audience became more erratic and the media landscape more brutal. The radiance of the once bright fame suddenly started to fade. Appearances were given less weight, bookings decreased, and critics who had previously been intimidated by his fame started to doubt the purpose of Hulkamania. The internal conflict, however, was the most significant. The question that had plagued Terry Bollea from the beginning of his career had to be faced. Without the spotlight, the opportunity, the belts, and the renown, who was he? He had dedicated years of his life to the story, giving it vitality, character, and selflessness. Now, as the cheers subsided, uncertainty occupied the empty space. He was no longer just a character. He was a one-man show, a brand that drew in everyone in his vicinity. Close friends and family were the ones who witnessed the change the most. They observed how tired he was, how his most animated anecdotes sounded practiced, and how laughter occasionally died before it could reach his eyes. America's favorite Hogan was a projection. The projection's creator found it difficult to balance his own realities of exhaustion, sorrow, and fear of becoming irrelevant with the demands of public adulation. He was motivated by the understanding that maintaining the mask was necessary for his existence, as well as the survival of others who relied on him, not by deceit. The double life was based on necessity rather than dishonesty. There was no place for the complexity of the man behind the mythology, since the world had become dependent on one version of him. The Bollea family found themselves adrift in the strange quiet that follows a storm as the cameras rolled, and Hogan Knows Best eventually departed the air. The conclusion of the show was not a neat conclusion, but rather the start of a new era filled with loss and uncertainty. After years of enjoying the show of Hogan's private life, the audience now eagerly looked for any weaknesses in the facade. Moments of human vulnerability were reframed as evidence of collapse by tabloid headlines, which jumped on reports of conflict and scandal. Terry Blee had to face a reality that no script could ease in the absence of the camera's unwavering stare. The guy who had once controlled the flow of thousands of people through venues, who had dominated sponsors and networks, suddenly found it difficult to steer the course of his own life. Every attempt at explanation was viewed with suspicion, stories were misrepresented in the media, and suffering was turned into money. He was not the creator of his own myth for the first time in decades. The instincts that had guided him through years of reinvention, however, were still there behind the bewilderment and grief. Terry Bollea had a deeper understanding of the power of adaptation than most people. Hulk Hogan would find a new way to survive if the world no longer desired him in his previous form. He created new tales, new channels, and new relationships with a dispersed and less understanding audience. He never saw the comeback as merely a publicity stunt. It was a resistance to disappear into the annals of popular culture, an act of survival. The character, Hulk Hogan, could never really die. Millions of people's memories were etched with his image, which was preserved in action figures and film clips, and was simultaneously the focus of nostalgia and ridicule. However, Terry Blee had to learn to live not only in the shadow of mythology, but also in its aftermath, creating a living amidst the remains of his most famous creation. It was time to look for purpose and atonement in the quiet areas that remained after the crowd had dispersed, not in the cheers of strangers. The public accounting. Hulk Hogan finds himself fighting a completely different kind of war in the years following the final bell. One battled in the glaring light of courtrooms, depositions, and unrelenting public scrutiny, rather than in the ring. The planned showmanship of WrestleMania was no more. The stakes were now high, and new charges, disclosures, and struggles for honor were made every day. Millions of people watched the lawsuits unfold like soap operas, paying close attention to every word, every tear, and every well-crafted apology. Spotlights were replaced by cameras, competitors were replaced with lawyers, and the noise of breaking news overpowered the crowd's roars, making them a faint recollection. What was previously a private aspect of his double existence turned into a spectacle. His personal life information, which had previously been concealed under his Hulk Hogan persona, were made public. Real-time analysis of friendships, betrayals, and transgressions was aired to a society that was desperate for heroes to fall. Only a maze of headlines and viral sound bites existed no haven. He woke up every morning unsure of which version of himself would be displayed on displays. The everlasting victor, or the profoundly imperfect human being. His double existence came to light. The myth persisted through it all. Hogan managed to remain unfazed even when he was at his lowest. Maybe dented, but never completely broken. Hulk Hogan made it through. The system needed him to survive, not the other way around. He was no longer just a man. He served as a storehouse for decades worth of shared longing, nostalgia, and childish fantasies. Erasing him would mean eliminating millions of people's comfort, and a live reminder of a time when heroes always prevailed, and good and evil appeared straightforward. When others broke under the weight of public exposure, his remarkable capacity to weather scandal ultimately became its own sort of redemption story. In some way, Hogan returned, less strong but not vanquished, and his double life was not eliminated, but simply adjusted to new realities, always with that same knowing smile. In every way, he was both a victim and a product of the narrative he had contributed to. Truth rarely prevails over appearance in the vast arena of public opinion. Long before the rest of the world did, he had discovered that lesson. The story would constantly adapt to the demands of the audience. There were many questions. The contradictions increased. Nevertheless, he always greeted his audience with a recognizable, mysterious smile when the curtain raised. A man who knew the script better than everyone else smiled. How did he escape punishment? In a world where every secret finally comes to light, what does it take to keep up two identities? For Terry Bollea under the bandana or Hulk Hogan, the solution was never outright deceit but rather remarkable adaptation. In the spotlight of celebrity, most people never really understand what he had realized. That consistency rather than honesty is what the public are looking for. Regardless of how the years or disclosures could weaken the guy, they wanted their hero to remain exactly as they remembered him. Living with that conflict was a skill Hogan had perfected. He was shielded by a peculiar form of communal amnesia, as long as he kept up the myth, uttering the catchphrases, flexing under the lights, and acting the part. Because the public favored the mythology over the uncomfortable truth, the brand, which was created in decades of pop cultural memory, could absorb almost any disruption. There were reboots, reconciliations, settlements, and apologies. However, continuity was the most crucial factor. The truth was not demanded by audiences. The warmth of their own reminiscence was what they demanded. There was more to the Hulkamania period than body slams and flashing lights. It was about creating a world where, for a few instants, the impossibly imaginable seemed possible. There was never any true concealment of his inner turmoil, insecurities, uncertainties, and suffering. He wasn't dishonest. He was a performer stuck in a character that was too big for him, a living mask that society demanded stay in place. The audience continued to clap despite knowing about the act and not wanting to break the enchantment. Applause, anticipation, and the tacit understanding that the drama must never really finish formed the walls of his jail. The man behind the legend. Now, in his latter years, Hulk Hogan is remembered as a warning story and a relic. The physical form that formerly embodied invincibility has aged. The golden mane is no longer there. Additionally, the garment no longer fits as a uniform, but rather as a remembrance. Each signed piece of memorabilia represents a man who gave up almost everything to preserve the ideal. Fame was not the only factor in Terry Bollea's double life. It was the result of a society that secretly enjoys its idols' imperfections, while demanding that they stay perfect. The story was about the overwhelming impossibility of embodying perfection, not about dishonesty. He walked a tightrope between myth and truth for decades, because he got away with it, and the world needed both. The brittle common man and the unbeatable champion were inextricably linked. Without the other, one could not exist. What do you think now that the myth has been dispelled? Did the audience want his double life, or did his celebrity create it? Leave a comment with your ideas. We appreciate you viewing this video with us, and we hope to see you in the next one.